Final Fantasy VII is my favorite video game of all time. Many people over the years have asked me why this game holds such a special place in my heart, and I've always found it so incredibly difficult to answer that question without going into too much detail. There are just so many reasons as to why I hold this game so dear, and in this video, I'm going to go over some of them, even though I know that by the end of it, there's still going to be so much left for me to discuss. But at least I'll sign off happily, knowing that my love letter to this game exists in some form, and that people have had the opportunity to view it. Up until this point on my channel, I've made 2 other videos of this nature. One on Bloodborne, and another one on Death Stranding, both of which are my second and third favorite games respectively. And now it's time to complete the trinity with Final Fantasy VII, my #1 favorite game of all time. Now is a better time than any to talk about this game, considering the upcoming release of Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, the PS5 enhanced version of last year's remake with additional story content included. Speaking of the remake, I loved it. Last year, when it was finally released on the PS4 after many long years of us Final Fantasy VII fans waiting, I was blown away by how faithfully Square Enix managed to recapture everything I loved about the first act of the original game and present it all so beautifully. They somehow managed to take the characters I knew and loved from the original and improve upon them in almost every way possible, and for that reason alone, it easily became my Game of the Year 2020. I'm incredibly excited to see the directions that Square Enix takes the future of this series, and I can't wait to play the first part of the remake again when it re-releases on the PS5 as the Intergrade expansion on June 10th. So in the meantime, let's go ahead and celebrate its upcoming release with this video. Before I go any further though, I'd like to mention that this video will contain heavy spoilers for the original Final Fantasy VII. It's nearly impossible for me to talk about why I love this game so much without getting into spoilers, so do keep that in mind going forward. Let's start by going back in time a little. It's the year 1999, June 16th, 1999 to be precise. This is a very important date to me. No, it's not when Final Fantasy VII was released, it's actually the date that I was released, or born, as ordinary people would put it. Final Fantasy VII came out 2 years prior to that on September 7th, 1997. The game was from before my time, and it was adored by many kids growing up in the 90s, including my older brother. And it's easy to see why. This was the first game in the franchise to be released on the PlayStation 1, the most technically advanced video game console at the time. The system's ability to run discs as opposed to cartridges was revolutionary and allowed for video games to soar to new heights. Final Fantasy VII was the epitome of that. It utilized the massive capacity of the CD-ROM format of the PlayStation 1 to transform the series in dramatic ways. Before that, the Final Fantasy franchise had maintained its presence on Nintendo's line of consoles, which were all cartridge-based. This meant that while the games sure were fun to play, they were severely limited when it came to both scale and graphics, at least by today's standards. Final Fantasy VII challenged this. It departed from the classic 2D sprite-based visuals, instead opting to use 3D character models with pre-rendered cutscenes. It also featured a rich world with a vastly improved scale, alongside a deep story with a memorable cast of characters. All this content and more spanned a total of 3 discs on the PlayStation, which would have purportedly equated to a whopping 16 cartridges had the game been released on the Nintendo 64, which Square Enix originally planned on doing. In addition to all of this, the game treaded new ground both tonally and thematically. Final Fantasy VII departed from the traditional medieval fantasy settings of the previous games and delved into a completely new cyberpunk-infused science fiction setting with darker and more mature themes that could reach greater audiences. Final Fantasy VII was groundbreaking, and its massive impact on the RPG genre and video games as a whole is indelible. And that's why it should come as no surprise that so many people who grew up in the 90s fell in love with this game. For many, this was their first real introduction to gaming, or at least the idea that video games are capable of being something more. Now the question is, how did I, someone who grew up long after this game was in its prime, come to love it as much as the kids who played it in the 90s did? Surely graphics, visuals, and gameplay would have drastically improved since 1997, right? The answer to that question is simple. Final Fantasy VII is a timeless classic. In my eyes, it's not just state-of-the-art visuals and gameplay that constitute an amazing game. This is why I was still able to enjoy Final Fantasy VII in the early 2010s, an entire decade after its release. Games during this time made significant improvements since the late 90s, boasting fully rendered 3D environments, real-time combat, voice acting, and so many other technical toppings that Final Fantasy VII didn't have. But even though I was used to these modern standards of my time, I still ended up loving this game just as much as anybody in the 90s would have, and that's because sometimes all a game really needs to stand the test of time is a great story with lovable characters, which I'll be touching on shortly. Music too plays a very important role in determining the timelessness of a game, and I can say with confidence that Final Fantasy VII easily has the greatest video game soundtrack I've ever listened to. Its composer was Nobuo Uematsu, and his score in every Final Fantasy game that he's worked on is nothing short of magical, and to this day, he remains my favorite video game composer ever. His pieces are beautiful and communicate every emotion, joy, anger, sadness, and nostalgia flawlessly. That this man was able to return for Final Fantasy VII Remake and remaster several iconic tracks from the original game was a blessing. Another thing that I'd like to point out about Final Fantasy VII that I really enjoy, even after all these years, is its combat. And this one is purely subjective, since I feel like a majority of people would agree that modern real-time combat in video games is far more engaging, and that turn-based combat belongs in the past. But personally, even to this day, I really enjoyed the vintage turn-based combat systems of the late 90s era of Final Fantasy games, especially those of 7 and 9, but 7's more. Each character in Final Fantasy VII has unique playstyles with a slew of ultimate attacks known as limit breaks suited for their class. And any character, regardless of which quote-unquote class they belong to, can perform any magical ability the player desires. This makes for some interesting combinations and synergies, and also adds for some degree of replayability. And that's because the player can only control up to 3 characters at once during combat, technically 2 since one of them is mandatory, despite having a much larger party, meaning that they can play the entire game with largely the same characters during combat without exploring any of the other ones. And the uniqueness of each character, both from a design and gameplay perspective, makes the idea of replaying the game as the ones you had not fought as before very exciting. And the characters themselves are what Final Fantasy VII being a timeless classic really boils down to, at least for me. They are, in my opinion, the game's greatest strength and what elevates Final Fantasy VII from simply being a game that I really enjoy to being my favorite game of all time. My top 3 favorite games have one thing in common. Their characters and the journeys that they embark on resonate with me on a very personal level, and help me to improve as an individual in some way. In my Death Stranding video, I talked about how Sam grows past his fear of connecting with others. He not only reconnects society, but he also begins to open up to others himself. This helped me with my social anxiety. In Bloodborne, I discussed how your playable character, the Hunter, perseveres through a hellish city to end the nightmare that plagues it. This helped me to conquer my fears. And here, with Final Fantasy VII, I'm going to talk about Cloud Strife, the main protagonist of the game and my favorite video game character ever. I'm going to talk about how this character helped me to grow as an individual and solidified Final Fantasy VII as my favorite game of all time. It's worth mentioning my earliest memories of playing video games, all of which took place on the PlayStation 1. This was a system that I loved watching my older brother play on when I was very young. He introduced me to the beautiful world of video games, and I remember playing various JRPG titles with him such as Legend of Dragoon, Chrono Cross, and Final Fantasy IX, which are all games that I still love dearly to this day. But it wasn't until I played Final Fantasy VII that I felt like I was playing something truly special. Granted, I only played the game's opening segment at the time, but I remember the excitement I felt as Cloud and Barret battled their way through a diesel punk-inspired factory to lay waste to a giant reactor run by an evil corporation. And although I understood none of this at the time, I still remember being so amazed at the visual presentation and music of it all. It's something that stuck with me for a long time. This blonde, spiky-haired guy, Cloud, the greatest video game character ever, stuck with me. Then, a few years later, in 2007, my brother and I got a PSP, and I remember one of the games he bought for it was Crisis Core, the prequel to Final Fantasy VII. At the time, I didn't even realize that the two games were connected. In fact, I probably couldn't even remember playing Final Fantasy VII for that brief moment when I was very young. Now, Crisis Core was one of the first games I ever beat to completion on my own, and was one of my first experiences with being emotionally impacted by a game, so much so that I was crying by the end of it. This game introduced me to video games as a narrative medium, and also the idea that they can be used to tell profound stories. And this is mainly due to how well written and compelling I found the game's main protagonist, Zack, to be. I was 7 years old and impressionable at the time I played the game, and as a result, I found Zack to be a major inspiration. His journey throughout the game, from humble beginnings to achieving his dream of becoming a hero and sacrificing his life for his best friend, was incredibly moving to me, and I knew that I wanted to be someone like him. One of the greatest parts of the game is the iconic moment where Zack meets Cloud for the first time and the two become good friends. This is the first time we actually see Cloud in the game, and the moment he removes his helmet to reveal who he is gives me chills to this day. The first time I saw that scene, I was hit with the realization that I was playing the prequel to Final Fantasy VII, that one game with the same spiky-haired guy I remember playing as for a brief moment when I was 5 years old, and it was then that I just knew I had to go back and play the original to completion after beating Crisis Core, a game that impacted me very deeply. So when I was around 14 and had the chance to borrow a MacBook from my school, I immediately played through the original game from start to finish using an emulator, and I'm glad that I did. Cloud's journey alongside a fantastic cast of characters whose stories I hold close to my heart was incredible to witness. It was an unforgettable experience that I'll treasure for the rest of my life. So, who is Cloud anyway? And why is he a big deal? In order to best explain this character and his impact on me, I feel like it's very important to highlight many key elements of Final Fantasy VII's narrative and cast of characters, and that's what I'm going to do. Final Fantasy VII takes place in the fictional planet of Gaia, which is run by a villainous megacorporation known as the Shinra Electric Power Company. Now, Gaia is a special planet. It is essentially a living thing with its own form of blood. This blood is known as the life stream, which flows through the planet's core. When every living organism ceases to be, their bodies become one with this life stream, thus prolonging the life of the planet. Shinra's goal is to harvest as much of the life stream as they can with giant reactors they've installed across Gaia in order to convert it into a form of liquid energy they sell known as Mako, which is the world's primary source of energy. Shinra essentially profits through killing the planet slowly, which is almost an analogy for our own real world, which is full of corporations who frack and deplete the environment of its natural resources, thus contributing to the slow demise of Earth. Clearly, the theme of Final Fantasy VII is life, and the game emphasizes the importance of protecting it at all costs, which I think is beautiful. Thousands of years ago, an ancient race of people known as the Cetra did just that. They were the guardians of the planet, and they had the ability to communicate with the life stream. They built a beautiful, sprawling civilization and lived in harmony with the humans. However, their existence came to an abrupt end when an alien parasite, or calamity from the skies, descended upon the planet and drew them to extinction. Thousands of years later, Shinra's team of scientists would excavate this alien and name it Genova. However, they mistakenly identified it as a member of the Cetra race. Shinra then comes to learn of the Cetra's fabled Promised Land, a world with infinite deposits of Mako. They believe that only a pure member of the Cetra race would be able to lead them there, so they begin work on recreating a member of the race using Genova's DNA. They call this endeavor the Genova Project. The result of it is Sephiroth, an unfathomably powerful human being who was injected with an incredibly high concentration of Genova's cells as a fetus. Shinra would go on to raise him and would tell him nothing of his past, other than the fact that he was an incredibly gifted child who was born of a woman named Genova. As an adult, he would go on to perform a myriad of heroic exploits, winning many wars for the company with his exceptional abilities. He was so powerful that Shinra created the Soldier Program, an elite force of super soldiers showered in Mako energy who could fight with enhanced capabilities similar to, but not on the same level, as Sephiroth. Sephiroth was a first-class member of Soldier, and the poster child for the program, and many, including our hero Cloud Strife, aspired to be like him from a young age, leaving their remote hometowns in search of grand opportunities in Midgar, the Mako-fueled metropolis and heart of Shinra. Now, Midgar is an extravagantly constructed city. It is essentially comprised of 8 sectors or districts, each powered by a giant Mako reactor, with the Shinra Electric Power Company being at the center of it all. And far beneath each of these sectors is a dwelling for the poor, known only as the slums. With the rich and the higher-ups of Shinra living above the plate, it becomes clear that there is an issue of socioeconomic inequality that is deeply embedded within the city. And this is one of the many mature themes that I really appreciate the game covering. Cloud presumably makes it to the top in Shinra, becoming a soldier first class, but at some point, for reasons unknown to us at the start, he becomes disillusioned with the company. And this is where our story begins. We start off Final Fantasy VII seeing Cloud, now a former member of Soldier, jumping off a train to assist a group of eco-warriors led by a man with a gun arm named Barrett Wallace in destroying one of Shinra's many reactors in Sector 1 of Midgar. Now, Cloud at first appears to be a very cold, reserved, and brooding character. The only reason he's helping Barrett in the beginning is because he's a mercenary looking to make some easy money. He doesn't seem to care about the planet nor Barrett's cause. And on top of this, Cloud is shown to be very powerful. The player immediately gets to experience his strength, quickly learning through their first few combat encounters that he's built differently. He's more than capable of fighting with his 15-pound signature weapon, the Buster Sword, and he also demonstrates a solid understanding of materia, the Mako condensed stones in the world of Gaia that grant the wielder the ability to cast magical spells. To sum it up simply, Cloud is a badass. He is the quintessential knight or super soldier that you love to roleplay as, since he is someone you can never aspire to be realistically. Think of it this way. When you play certain games like God of War or The Witcher, you love to play as Kratos or Geralt of Rivia since they possess godlike abilities that offer you a form of escapism. They allow you to immerse yourself within a fantasy where you can be something more than yourself. This is the true appeal of role-playing games. At first, Cloud seems no different, and to the player, he too appears to be within this pantheon of video game characters who make you feel empowered. And that couldn't be truer for me on my first playthrough of Final Fantasy VII. At that time, I was in high school. I didn't have a lot of friends, and I was very socially anxious. And so when I played as Cloud, all of my insecurities and inadequacies started to drift away as I began to feel more powerful. I looked up to Cloud the same way I looked up to Zack from Crisis Core. And so to me, despite being a fictional character, Cloud was a major inspiration. And by the end of the game, he still was, albeit for a completely different reason. And that last point there is going to be very important later on in this video. As you progress through Final Fantasy VII, you learn more about Cloud's mysterious past. You're told that as a child he had grand ambitions of moving to Midgar and making a big name for himself. As a child, he made a promise to his crush Tifa Lockhart that he'd become a soldier someday and come to her rescue if she were ever to be in danger. And he also expresses his dream of fighting alongside the planet's greatest hero, Sephiroth. If there were ever a cautionary tale as to why you should never meet your heroes, Final Fantasy VII would be it. This is because Sephiroth is the true villain of the game. The renowned hero and assumed protector of the planet who I spoke of earlier is long gone by the time the game begins, for Sephiroth in his physical form is dead, with his demise being brought about by an abrupt descent into villainy. And throughout the game, the Sephiroth we encounter is merely the personification of his will, which is being controlled by his physical body from within the lifestream in the northern crater, the area struck by Genova's meteor that wiped out the Cetra race. Sephiroth isn't revealed to us until the tail end of the game's first act. Up until then, he is only mentioned a handful of times, and is treated like a boogeyman of sorts, a terrifying urban legend who the player dreads ever having to meet. The suspense leading up to his reveal is handled brilliantly by the game, and is arguably one of the best introductions to a villain ever written. The player learns that Shinra never truly was the ultimate enemy, and that they, alongside the rest of the planet, are mere playthings to Sephiroth. Sephiroth reveals that his goal is to utilize an ancient destructive materia belonging to the Cetra known as Black Materia to summon a meteor to clash with the planet, forcing the lifestream to erupt and heal the wound as a defense mechanism. When this happens, he plans to absorb the essence of the lifestream, thus transforming himself into a god. Besides his terrifying intentions, sheer power, and the fear-inducing way in which he is introduced to the player, there is a very good reason as to why Sephiroth is considered to be one of the most iconic video game villains to ever exist. It's because despite how much of a monster, supernatural force, and godlike entity he is shown to be, he is still human. And let me explain what I mean by that. Sephiroth's scheme on the surface sounds like the stereotypical plot of a villain to achieve world domination and to be worshipped for eons to come. However, his motivations stem from a very human emotion: hatred. It is revealed that 5 years before the events of the game, back when Sephiroth was still alive and on humanity's side, Shinra tasked both him and Cloud, two first-class members of Soldier, with investigating a broken Mako reactor spewing forth monsters in Cloud's hometown of Nibelheim. Accompanying them were two lowly Shinra troops. Upon reaching the reactor in the mountains bordering the town, Sephiroth inspects the monsters within the tanks there and realizes that they were once human, and that their bodies are composed of an unspeakably high degree of Mako energy. He also discovers that the body of Jenova, the individual he was told was his mother, is an alien organism being contained within the very same facility. Sephiroth comes to the harrowing realization that these monsters are not only a product of Mako, but also Jenova's cells, and that he too may be no different from them. Naturally, he begins to search for answers. For several days, Sephiroth locks himself within the basement of Shinra Manor, an abandoned building on the edge of Nibelheim. It was here that Shinra scientists conducted the Jenova project many years ago that led to Sephiroth's creation. While there, Sephiroth reads through countless research notes surrounding his origins while slowly losing his sanity. Ultimately, he draws the false conclusion that Jenova was a Cetra, and that when the calamity from the skies came to wipe out her race, the humans abandoned the Cetra to save themselves. And this is what fuels his bitter resentment towards humanity. He believes that as Jenova's son, and the last remaining survivor of the Cetra race, the planet is his birthright, and that the humans deserve nothing but pain for stealing that from him and betraying the Cetra thousands of years ago. Thus begins his quest to enact vengeance for the Cetra's suffering, which is incredibly tragic when you consider that Sephiroth's hatred and descent into madness was based entirely on a misunderstanding. Jenova never was a Cetra, she was the calamity from the skies, and Sephiroth never was her literal son. He was born of a human woman named Lucrezia Crescent, who was injected with the cells of Jenova. But unfortunately, none of these truths end up mattering in the end. Sephiroth begins exacting his revenge on humankind by burning down Nibelheim and killing everyone there. The only survivors of his massacre end up being Cloud, Tifa, and a few townspeople. Tifa is saved by her martial arts instructor and is taken to Midgar, where she spends the next 5 years recovering and settling down as a bartender in its Sector 7 slums. And this is where we first encounter her in the game. However, what happens to Cloud in the 5-year gap between the Nibelheim incident and the beginning of the game remains a mystery to us, at least for a while. Cloud recaps the Nibelheim incident from his perspective, and Tifa hints that there may be something wrong with his memories, for he seems to remember certain things that he shouldn't, and can't remember the things that he should. As a result, Cloud can't recall what happens after he confronts Sephiroth, other than the fact that Tifa was gravely wounded by him. And Tifa reveals that Sephiroth physically was declared killed in action by the Shinra News Network. The significance of the Nibelheim incident, other than shedding light on Cloud's past, his nemesis, and Sephiroth's origins, is that it reveals a major theme throughout Final Fantasy VII, which is the crushing of tropes and cliches. This, in my opinion, is where the game truly shines. There is more to each and every character in this game than what they appear to be on the surface, and they consequently appear more human-like than we may have initially thought. Sephiroth, despite his messiah complex and terrifying godlike presence, is at his core a man consumed by hatred and revenge due to a misunderstanding. And next to him, all 9 major characters who you encounter throughout the game have this deeper side to them that drastically differs from their outward appearances. And it's worth examining just a few of them, namely the first 4 characters you encounter in the first act of your adventure: Tifa, Barret, Aerith, and of course our main protagonist, Cloud. Tifa is a character who at first appears to be a fearsome brawler, but in actuality she is revealed to be a rather shy and gentle person. She is emotionally mature and only wants to help others and protect them, despite her past hardships involving the death of her mother at a young age and the destruction of her hometown and killing of her father at the hands of Sephiroth. Barret, a strong man with a rough exterior, holds an undying grudge against Shinra and vows to tear down everything they stand for. This is because of how they once promised Barret and his village of Corel, a mining town, a better future through installing a Mako reactor there. When the reactor exploded, Shinra blamed Corel and would burn the village to the ground, killing everyone close to Barrett except for his adopted daughter, Marlene. But in spite of everything Barrett endured and the brutish man he appears to be, he still has a surprisingly soft heart and a touching appreciation for both his loved ones and nature. And then there's Aerith, the woman we see in the opening cinematic to Final Fantasy VII. Aerith, in my opinion, is the most important character to the game's narrative besides Cloud himself. She is the last surviving member of the Cetra race, and as a result, she can be thought of as representing the fragility of life, which I think is a beautiful interpretation of her character. As a seemingly innocent flower girl living in the Sector 5 slums of Midgar, Aerith immediately strikes us as the archetypal maiden, a gentle character who provides comforting moral and physical support to her friends and relies on them to see their victories through. However, through her dialogue and actions, we quickly learn that she is much more than that. Aerith is a strongly independent, high-spirited, and bold character who always takes the initiative to fiercely protect both her friends and the planet, so much so that in the end, she gives up her life for them. Using a holy materia passed down for generations amongst the Cetra, Aerith prays for the planet's assistance in stopping Sephiroth, only to be abruptly impaled by him. Her death, alongside Zack's at the end of Crisis Core, are two of the saddest I've ever experienced in fiction to this day. And to say that they didn't drive me to tears would be a lie. To many, including myself, Aerith's death is shocking and devastating because of the long period of time you spend growing attached to her in the game, and how much of an integral member of your party she becomes. But what truly makes it gut-wrenching to me is how everything about Aerith's character points towards her making it. If this were any other Final Fantasy title, or role-playing game for that matter, Aerith, a seemingly pure maiden who represents the goodness of life, nature, and the planet, would have lived. And that's what makes her death so tragic. The world of Final Fantasy VII is not the kind to reward heroes and maidens. It is an incredibly harsh and unforgiving world that punishes characters like Zack and Aerith. It instead rewards complexity, flaws, and inadequacies, and those who possess those qualities are the ones who do get to make it. And that brings us to Cloud. Do you remember how I said that from the moment you control Cloud, you feel empowered? How he represents the appeal of role-playing games, and that he allows you to play as someone you wish you could be? A hardened super soldier or a gallant knight serving as inspiration to you, the player? Well, soon enough, this all begins to fall apart. Shortly after Aerith's death, Cloud and his party pursue Sephiroth's apparition to the northern crater, where, as I said before, his physical body lies dormant. It is at this point in the game where we see the beginning of the end for the cold, unstoppable tough guy who we saw jump off the train at the start. This is where Cloud changes forever. In an effort to obtain the black materia that Cloud and his party procures, Sephiroth attempts to break Cloud by convincing him that he was a puppet created by a mad scientist named Professor Hojo from Shinra, and that his past was entirely fabricated. Cloud initially protests this, claiming that he remembers the events that transpired 5 years ago during the Nibelheim incident, but then he starts to doubt himself. And this is where all the hints of Cloud's unreliable memories and gaps in his knowledge culminate, with him questioning several basic things about himself that he should obviously know, such as, when did I join Soldier? And then, two things happen. One, Tifa witnesses this entire exchange and doesn't seem to validate Cloud's recollection of the Nibelheim incident at all, despite having been there herself. And two, Sephiroth shows Cloud a photo that Tifa's father took of both her and the two soldier members who arrived to investigate the Mako reactor 5 years ago in Nibelheim. And in that photo, Cloud is nowhere to be seen. Instead, in his place, it is Zack. This is when Cloud is at his lowest point, and the entire facade of him being an unstoppable force, an incredible soldier, totally shatters. He believes what Sephiroth is saying, that he is nothing more than a clone created by Professor Hojo, and he dejectedly hands the black materia to Sephiroth, fully accepting his defeat and apologizing to his friends for not being able to stop him. He then falls into the lifestream, entering a coma. Later, Tifa and the party find Cloud in his comatose state in the remote town of Mideel, where a group of villagers found him washed up on the shore. It isn't long before a giant biomechanical organism known as Ultimate Weapon, the planet's response to Sephiroth summoning the meteor, attacks the village, causing both Cloud and Tifa to fall into the lifestream again. This enables Tifa to enter Cloud's subconscious, where she systematically restores his true memories and former personality. There it is revealed that Cloud did actually exist as a child in Nibelheim, and that he was never a puppet created by Hojo, as Sephiroth suggested. However, many things we were led to believe about him were wrong. He and Tifa were never actually as close as we were led to believe. In fact, Cloud was a very shy kid who distanced himself from everyone, while Tifa was quite popular and hung out with a large group of kids. Time and time again, Cloud would attempt to talk to her, but could never make it happen. Then, one day after Tifa's mother passed away, Tifa believed that she could meet her in the mountains beyond Nibelheim, not fully grasping the concept of death. She and her friends embark on this expedition, only for her friends to abandon her on the way up. And unbeknownst to them, Cloud ends up following as well, and is the only one to stay with Tifa. Then, Tifa loses her step on a bridge and ends up falling. Cloud attempts to catch her, but just like with everything else, he fails at this too and ends up falling as well. Her father and several townspeople blame Cloud for Tifa's trip up the mountain, and the two don't talk for another 5 years. The next time they meet, and the only true interaction that they have, is the night at the water tower where Cloud promises Tifa that he would join Soldier. However, this never ended up happening. All that Cloud ever amounted to at Shinra was a lowly security officer. Remember the two grunts who I said accompanied Sephiroth and the other soldier operative to Nibelheim? Cloud was one of them. Cloud was nothing more than one of the thousands of insignificant and expendable Shinra troops. He never amounted to anything. He was so ashamed at never achieving his dreams that when it came time for him to return to Nibelheim years after he made his promise to Tifa, he never removed his helmet so that Tifa would never find out about how he failed to keep his promise to her. This is why Cloud remembers everything that happened during the Nibelheim incident, and why Tifa couldn't remember him being there. The person she instead remembered being there with Sephiroth was Zack. Zack was the embodiment of everything we were led to believe Cloud was. Zack was the one who ended up becoming Soldier First Class. Zack was the one who was friends with Sephiroth, and Zack was the one who faced Sephiroth when he began his massacre. But most importantly, Zack wasn't the one to kill Sephiroth in his physical form. It was none other than Cloud himself. Cloud, a mere mortal who at the time had no superhuman powers, gets back up and kills Sephiroth, a god in his eyes. He moves Tifa's wounded body to safety, picks up Zack's Buster Sword, and in a fit of rage, stabs Sephiroth with his back turned, simply stating, "Mom, Tifa, my town, give it back." Sephiroth retaliates by impaling Cloud, but Cloud, driven by pure anger, grips Sephiroth's sword and hurls him into a vat of Mako beneath the reactor, disintegrating his body. This Cloud, a weak kid defined by failure and unachieved dreams, killed a god. For the next 4 years, Shinra covers up the incident, declares Sephiroth dead, and rebuilds Nibelheim. Professor Hojo rounds up the survivors and begins work on testing something he called the Genova reunion theory, which suggests that organisms containing cells that have been separated from the alien Genova can be influenced by her mind and recalled to her body. He puts this theory to the test by injecting high doses of both Mako energy and Genova cells into all the survivors of Sephiroth's massacre, including Zack and Cloud, but not Tifa since, as I mentioned earlier, she was rescued by her martial arts instructor and taken to Midgar. Because Zack was already a member of Soldier and had thus been exposed to large amounts of Mako as part of his initiation into the program, Hojo's experiments had no effect on him whatsoever. However, Cloud, an ordinary human with no prior Mako conditioning at all, couldn't handle the treatment. His body went into a state of shock, and he experienced something known as Mako poisoning. After years of torture, Zack was finally able to break both himself and Cloud out of containment, and he attempts to hightail it back to Midgar with him. He spends a year on the road, carrying a comatose Cloud on his shoulder with the hopes of making it back to Aerith, Zack's lover. However, this wasn't meant to be, as right on the outskirts of the city, Zack was gunned down by a squad of Shinra troops. This is when Cloud awakens. On his dying breath, Zack entrusts his Buster Sword to Cloud. Cloud is so traumatized by his best friend's death, the destruction of his hometown, and the effects of the experiments on his brain that he develops a false identity in which Zack's stories as he knew them become his own. An identity where all of his fantasies of becoming a soldier, a hero, and fighting alongside Sephiroth were all true. Even though Cloud rejected Zack's high-spirited, friendly, and optimistic nature, instead opting to emulate the cold and battle-hardened persona that he always perceived soldiers as encompassing, he still played the charade of his friend who embodied all of his dreams. Cloud would carry Zack's Buster Sword to Midgar, later collapsing at its Sector 7 station due to sheer exhaustion. Upon awakening, he is reunited with Tifa with his false identity and all the enhancements of a soldier operative, given that he was indirectly exposed to the soldier treatment by Hojo's experiments, and this is why he is so powerful. He then goes on to assist Tifa and Barret with taking down Shinra. And this is the Cloud we see jump off the train at the start of Final Fantasy VII. This Cloud, the Cloud we thought we knew throughout the entire game, is at his core revealed to us to be nothing more than a weak man. When Cloud comes to remember all of this with the help of Tifa within his subconscious, she supports him through his worst and reassures him that it's okay that he didn't achieve his dreams, that it's okay that he didn't become what he told her he would be, and most importantly, that it's okay to be himself. This is a beautiful message that speaks volumes about the importance of friendship and being there for your friends when they're at their weakest. Tifa's acceptance of Cloud leads him to doing something remarkable. He accepts himself, and once again reignites his determination to defeat Sephiroth once and for all. And it's not the cold, powerful, and seemingly unstoppable Cloud we meet at the beginning of the game who goes on to do this, but it's the Cloud who never amounted to anything nor achieved anything meaningful in his life. The Cloud who everybody ignored as a child, and the Cloud who experienced a great many tragedies. The Cloud who was a loser. He, along with all of his friends and his rekindled, kind, loving, and optimistic personality, ends up saving the planet. It's no coincidence that whenever we see Cloud defeating Sephiroth, it's when he's himself, with all of his memories and identity in check. We first see this happen during the Nibelheim incident, where Cloud kills Sephiroth in a fit of rage as an ordinary human. And then we see it happen once again at the end of the game, where Cloud defeats Sephiroth once and for all, and with the help of Aerith from the livestream, disintegrates the meteor headed for the planet. I think that the message intended here by the writers of Final Fantasy VII is a powerful one that I think we can all benefit from hearing. It's that you should embrace yourself. It's that you are worth more than you'll ever know. Never think for 1 second that your identity is defined by the things you wish you'd done or the dreams you never achieved, and you will go on to achieve a great many things with your own unique soul. Because of that message, it felt like this game was made specifically for me, and is the main reason why my eyes welled up with tears the first time I completed Final Fantasy VII. As I said before, I started this game thinking that it was giving me the opportunity to be better than I could ever be in real life. I felt strong as Cloud. I thought Cloud was amazing in the same way that Zack was, and then he allowed me to pretend to be someone more powerful and amazing than I could ever be. But then, I was hit with the crushing realization that Cloud and I were more alike than I thought. We were fundamentally the same. He wasn't a knight in shining armor, a monster slayer, a god of war, or some flawless super soldier. No, Cloud was just an ordinary guy. He was a guy with almost no friends, who lived in a remote town far away from the city, with his only true friend being his mother. And this is something I could relate to so much. I never had many friends growing up since I lived far away from my school in a small neighborhood, and I spent a lot of time with my mom at home. And another thing is that Cloud never did anything truly meaningful, which again was much like me due to my anxiety and fear of taking risks. So to compensate for all this, he essentially roleplays as his late friend Zack, someone who achieved all the remarkable things that he never could. This is incredibly meta in the sense that myself and many other kids play RPGs for the very same reason, to escape our mundane realities. Cloud's character is a powerful commentary on role-playing games, that while fictional characters allow us to live the realities that we sometimes wish we could have ourselves, the only reality we need to live in is the one we have right in front of us, the one we're blessed with since the moment we're born, our own realities. This character taught me that it's okay to be myself, that even with my inadequacies and insecurities, I will achieve great things someday, and you will too. And this, to me, is why Cloud Strife is the greatest video game character ever written, and more importantly, why he makes Final Fantasy VII my favorite video game of all time.